What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a comparison between the new Samsung Galaxy S20 FE and the flagship S20 from earlier this year. Right off the bat, I'll just tell you guys up front that these two phones are very, very similar. And if you don't want to pay a ton of money for the regular flagship S20, you can pretty much get 95% of the specs and features just going with the S20 FE instead, and save a few $100s in the process. There are a couple of important things I want to talk about here though, so let's just go ahead and get into it, and hopefully by the end, this will help you decide which one of these devices might be right for you. First off, let's actually talk about price, since that's likely the first thing you'll be considering. The new S20 FE launched with a retail price of $699, but actually, at the time of filming this video, places like Samsung and Amazon and Best Buy are running sort of an introductory promotion, and they have this phone listed for $100 cheaper, $599. And honestly, that is a really good price for this device. The flagship S20, of course, launched earlier this year for $999, and if you buy a new S20 from pretty much anywhere, that is still what this phone is going for. Now, if you want, you can snag a used or renewed S20 instead from places like Amazon or Swappa for between $650 and $700. That'll definitely save you a bunch of money and bring the prices of these phones closer together, but any way you look at it, you're still going to be paying a bit more money, no matter what, for the flagship S20. And if you guys are interested in doing some comparison shopping of your own or want to check in on those deals that I mentioned, I'll leave some links down below in the video description to where you can get these phones at their cheapest current prices. Physically, these two phones are obviously pretty different, and I think it's sort of going to come down to what you personally value. The new S20 FE is a fairly large 6.5 inch device, while the flagship S20 comes in at 6.2 inches. I think realistically, a more fair comparison would be to put the FE up against the S20 Plus, which is slightly larger at 6.7 inches, but it really just depends on what you personally like. With the FE, you obviously get a ton of screen real estate. It's one of the larger phones you can buy at this price range, and I think a lot of people will like that. At the same time though, the smaller flagship S20 is much more comfortable, especially with one-handed use, so that might be a benefit to some folks as well. One other thing worth mentioning just real quick is that the FE has a totally flat display, while the flagship S20 has a slightly curved display along the edge. It's super subtle, but in the slightest of ways, the curved glass makes the flagship S20 feel just a little bit thinner, though I know not everyone even likes the curved display anyway. As far as the materials, the FE gets a plastic back, while the flagship S20 of course has the premium all-glass rear cover, but interestingly enough with the FE, this is the same sort of fit and finish as the Note 20, this sort of smooth matte feel that mimics frosted glass, but obviously isn't actually glass. The actual glossy glass of the S20 looks super nice and is very premium, but it of course is more delicate. The important thing here though is that the frames of both of these phones are metal, so they feel heavy and sturdy. The polished sides give off an equally premium vibe, and neither phone compromises on features. Both phones offer wireless charging and reverse wireless charging via Samsung's PowerShare, and they are both IP68 water and dust resistant. So while the rear plastic back on the FE might seem to be the cheaper material, in the end you don't actually sacrifice much, if anything at all. Taking a look around at everything else, on the left side neither phone has anything going on, but on the right side you get the same power and volume buttons. On the top, both phones have a dual SIM and SD card tray for expandable storage, and down below there's the USB-C charging port and speaker, with both phones offering a dual stereo speaker setup with the additional one in the earpiece. Around back, both devices have a triple lens camera setup, which I'll go more in depth with in just a minute, and underneath the front display, both phones also offer an in-display fingerprint reader. With speed and accuracy, I actually found them to be pretty close. The flagship S20 is usually just a tiny bit faster in getting to the lock screen, and the only other thing I noticed is the placement is pretty pretty different too. Now with Face Unlock, on the other hand, the FE is actually almost always faster, which is really interesting. And that may have to do with the FE just having a better front camera than the flagship S20, which I will talk about momentarily. Up to this point, these two phones have been pretty close in terms of what they really offer, but with the displays, this is where we see the first major difference worth considering. Of course, we already mentioned the size differences, but it goes a bit further than that. The 6.5-inch FE offers a Super AMOLED panel with a maximum resolution of 2400 by 1080, packing in about 407 pixels per inch. The flagship S20, on the other hand, has a smaller 6.2-inch Super AMOLED screen, but offers QHD resolution, up to 3200 by 1440 at 563 pixels per inch. And it's also covered in the newer, stronger Gorilla Glass 6. Now, higher resolution aside, there is one more important feature these two phones share with the displays, and that's a 120Hz high refresh rate option. Both phones can be set to 120Hz, which on the flagship S20 is expected, but on the FE, I think this is a great addition for a device in this price range. At the same time, with the flagship S20, you have to choose whether you want to run either the 120Hz option or QHD. You can't do both at the same time. So in the end, if you choose 120Hz, you don't even utilize the higher resolution. I think that even things out a bit, honestly. If you're really into getting the highest resolution possible, obviously going with QHD on the flagship S20 is great, but I personally value the 120Hz option more. The phone just feels so much faster and so smooth. It's really a great experience. And in particular, getting that feature on the much cheaper FE is really awesome. And honestly, aside from the potential boost in resolution, I do think everything else with these displays, the color and brightness and overall viewing experience is all pretty much the same, which is great. They are both phenomenal phones with great looking screens, but for me personally, the value you get on the FE versus the flagship S20 is just super hard to ignore. Okay, so let's talk about specs, since I think this is what most people are concerned about, and I'll just keep it simple. Both of these phones are powered by the Snapdragon 865 chipset and Adreno 650 GPU. The FE can be configured with 6 or 8 gigabytes of RAM, while the flagship S20 gets a bit more with 8 and 12 gigabyte options. And the FE has 128 or 256 gigabytes of UFS 3.1 storage, while the flagship S20 actually only has one option of 128 gigs and UFS 3.0 storage. Now, side by side, both of these phones are going to perform almost identically when it comes to just quickly launching and loading some default apps, and that should come as no surprise, but actually every once in a while, the FE does beat the flagship S20, which is sort of interesting. Realistically, as you start to load more and more apps, having more RAM on the flagship S20 may prove to be beneficial for keeping things current and having a bunch of stuff running in the background. But here's the bottom line. The FE is still powered by 2020 flagship specs from start to finish. And I gotta be honest, if I paid $1,000 for the flagship S20 6 or 7 months ago when it first came out, I would be kind of upset seeing the FE now have almost the same exact specs for less money. Samsung is really bringing their launches closer and closer together. And not only that, with just so many phones out there now that are so close together with their performance and specs, it's becoming tougher and tougher to justify spending more when you hardly get much more in the end. The FE is a crazy good value simply because you're getting literally 2020 flagship specs in a phone that's 2/3 the price of its flagship counterpart that isn't even a year old yet. And to be honest, unless you go with a 12 gigs of RAM on the flagship S20, I don't even think the difference between 6 and 8 is all that important either between these two phones. That's exactly what I'm working with here with the two devices, 6 gigs of RAM on the FE and 8 gigs on the flagship S20, and it's really not that big of a difference at all. In the end, really the thing to keep in mind is just that while the FE is a cheaper phone positioned as maybe a mid-range device overall and the lowest level S20, with performance and internal specs, you sacrifice next next to nothing going with this phone, and it makes the flagship S20 really look like not such a great deal. Also, the new S20 FE has a slightly larger battery at 4,500 milliamps versus 4,000 on the flagship S20. This makes sense since it's a larger phone and can fit a larger battery, and it's not a huge deal, but it is still something to consider, and while it likely won't yield hours of additional use, the small improvements you might see based on your usage could just be one more small surprising advantage in going with the cheaper phone. Finally, let's talk about those cameras. And I have to say right away that I was actually wrong in my initial thoughts as far as what all is going on here. Now, both of these phones have a triple lens camera around back, and interestingly enough, 2 out of the 3 lenses appear to be the same. Both phones get a 12 megapixel main lens and 12 megapixel ultra wide lens. With the FE, the telephoto lens is just an 8 megapixel shooter, while on the flagship S20 you get that 64 megapixel lens instead, and I'll talk about that in a second, but up front, the FE has a better selfie camera, a 32 megapixel lens, while the flagship S20 has just a 10 megapixel shooter. And in my initial selfie tests here, I have to say that I think the FE pictures look quite a bit better. They're much more detailed, they're more accurate with their color and skin tone, they don't wash out my face so much, and there's less smoothing in the skin too. Once again, just another surprising result here that seems to favor the FE. With the rear camera setup, you get nearly everything with both phones as far as shooting modes and features. The thing you do miss out on really is just 8K video. The flagship S20 has it obviously, while the FE does not offer it, but I don't really know that many people who would actively choose that as their primary video option anyway. As far as I can tell, most everything else is identical. Even like Pro Video is here on the FE. Now with the telephoto lens, both phones do offer that crazy 30 times zoom, which is sort of interesting, and you might think it maybe isn't as good on the FE since technically the lens isn't as great on paper, but megapixels aren't everything, and in the couple tests that I've tried, and this is where I was proven wrong, the FE and flagship S20 look about the same, and sometimes the FE even looks a little better. Really, the flagship S20 just utilizes that 64 megapixel telephoto lens more for its high megapixel shooting mode, not so much for the zoom. And I'm gonna put these cameras to the test in a dedicated video here shortly so we can really analyze things, but it seems to me that these camera setups are almost identical, which is really surprising. So here are my final thoughts. Like I mentioned earlier, if I bought an S20 or an S20 Plus sometime this year, but especially in the past couple of months, and paid full price for it, I'd be pretty upset to see this new FE. This phone packs just about everything the 2020 flagship phones have, aside from the QHD display and glass back. But the phone comes in at hundreds of dollars less. This is an interesting move by Samsung, and for those of you who were maybe waiting to buy a new device, maybe for the holiday season, I would say that the FE is now the phone to buy. It's just a crazy good deal in comparison. But what do you guys think? Would you maybe go with a used flagship S20 instead if that were an option? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.